Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we cross the cold, grey water of the North Sea with an army unlike anything the Viking world has ever assembled, following one man whose body betrays him at every turn, and whose mind makes entire kingdoms kneel anyway. Picture him now. He cannot stand without help. He cannot walk without pain twisting through him like a blade, and yet men twice his size will not meet his eyes. That is the story you are stepping into. You probably won't survive what he has planned for England, so let's be honest about that from the start. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. I always love picturing exactly where in the world you're drifting off to sleep tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is deep in the 9th century, somewhere in the misty edges of what will one day be called Denmark, and a longhouse stands lit by firelight, thick with smoke and the smell of roasted meat. Inside, a woman screams and a legend is born. He arrives small, oddly formed, his limbs strange in a way that makes the older women in the room fall quiet. No one in that longhouse could imagine that the fragile bundle crying by the fire will one day be spoken of in the same breath as kings, and be feared by every soul on an island he has never seen. His father is Ragnar Lothbrok, a name that already carries weight across the northern world, a raider, a schemer, a man whose reputation for daring borders on myth even in his own lifetime. Whether every tale told about Ragnar is true is something historians still argue about, and honestly, you should hold Ragnar's legend a little loosely too, because the sagas love him too much to be fully honest. But what matters for tonight is this. Ragnar has sons, and among them one boy grows up different from the rest. While his brothers wrestle and spar and toughen their bodies against the northern cold, this boy watches from the side, learning something his brothers never bother to learn. He learns how to make other men do the fighting for him. Now picture him, a few years later, a young man on the edge of a hall where warriors are arguing about vengeance. Word has reached the Viking world. Ragnar Lothbrok is dead, and not in the way a Viking is supposed to die, sword in hand, laughing at fate. No. The stories say he was thrown into a pit, crawling with venomous snakes, delivered there on the orders of an English king named Ella, ruler of Northumbria. And here is what you have to understand. Whether the pit was full of real serpents, or whether the tale grew serpents the way all good legends do, the effect on Ragnar's sons is the same. Grief curdles into rage, and rage curdles into planning. You would expect the loudest son to lead the charge for revenge. You would expect the strongest brother, the one who can crush a skull with his bare hands, to stand at the front of the hall and demand blood. But it isn't him. It's the boy who cannot walk unaided, the one who has spent his whole life being underestimated, who rises carried, some say, on the shoulders of loyal men, and speaks with a calm that makes the hall go silent. He doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. There's something almost unsettling about a man promising devastation in a voice this quiet, and that, more than any physical strength, is the first hint of who he really is. His name, as history and legend will remember him, is Ivar. But not just Ivar. Ivar, they will call him the Boneless. And we'll dig into exactly what that unsettling nickname means very soon, because trust me, the truth is stranger and in some ways sadder than you might expect. For now, know this: revenge alone doesn't explain what Ivar is about to do. Plenty of grieving sons in the Viking world raid a coastal village, burn a monastery, take some silver and call the debt paid. Ivar has something bigger in mind, something that will take years to unfold, something that will reshape an entire island. He begins gathering ships. Not 2 or 3 for a quick raid, but dozens, then more. Drawing warriors from fjords and settlements across the north, men hungry for plunder, for land, for a piece of the fortune England seems to promise. Word spreads that Ragnar's sons are assembling something enormous, and warriors who would normally fight for no one but themselves start arriving anyway, pulled in by rumour and ambition. There's a darkly funny irony sitting underneath all of this if you squint at it right. The coming invasion, the one that will terrify an entire nation, is being organized in large part by a man who needs assistance simply to cross a room. English chroniclers, when they eventually try to make sense of what happens, will struggle to reconcile the two ideas: a broken body, an unbreakable will, and honestly so will a lot of modern historians. Across the water, England sleeps in its usual patchwork of rival kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, each one distracted by its own quarrels, none of them imagining that the fractured coalition gathering in the north will soon arrive not as a raiding party, but as something the chronicles will simply call the Great Heathen Army. And at the heart of it, wrapped in furs carried rather than walking, sits the man they will one day fear more than any of them ever feared his father. The ships are almost ready. The tide is turning, and somewhere on that dark northern coastline, Ivar the Boneless is about to set an entire island on a collision course with his vengeance. The wind off the coast carries salt and smoke, and somewhere among the gathered ships, men are already whispering the name that will follow this figure through every chronicle, every saga, every fireside retelling for the next 1200 years. Boneless. It rolls strangely off the tongue, doesn't it? Not fearsome in the way Ironside or Bloodaxe sounds fearsome. It sounds almost like a joke, the kind of nickname you'd expect to shame a man rather than immortalize him. And here is what you have to understand. Nobody in that Viking camp is laughing when they say it. So what does it actually mean? This is where the trail gets genuinely murky and where you should lean in close, because even now, over 1,000 years later, scholars still don't agree. One theory, and probably the most commonly repeated one, suggests Ivar suffered from a condition affecting his bones directly. Something in the medical world today might resemble a disorder causing extreme brittleness, or perhaps a congenital condition that left his legs too fragile or too malformed to bear his own weight. Picture it: a boy who watches his brothers run and wrestle and climb, rigging on Viking longships, while his own legs simply will not cooperate, will not hold him upright without assistance, might even fracture under stress that a normal child's bones would shrug off entirely. If that's the truth, then the boy who becomes one of the most feared warlords in early medieval Europe spent his entire childhood being carried, propped, assisted, and somehow transformed that daily humiliation into an engine of ambition, so ferocious it would eventually make an entire nation say his name in fear. But that's only one theory, and here's where it gets interesting. Some later medieval writers offer an entirely different reading. In certain versions of the saga, tradition boneless isn't about his legs at all. It's a euphemism, a coded reference to impotence, to some absence of male vigor that in the blunt, often crude humor of Norse storytelling became wrapped into this nickname instead of stated outright. It's almost darkly funny if you think about it. A warlord so terrifying that chroniclers who wanted to insult him had to resort to riddles rather than say it to his face, even in writing, even after he was dead. And then there's a third possibility, one some historians raise almost as a compromise, that boneless might simply be poetic exaggeration, a dramatic flourish meaning something closer to supple or flexible, perhaps even referencing unusual agility or a body that moved in ways that unsettled onlookers rather than any specific disability at all. You can imagine how frustrating this must be for historians who want a clean answer. There isn't one. The sources contradict each other. The sagas were written generations after Ivar lived, and the truth of his body has been buried under layers of storytelling ever since. What we do know, pieced together from the fragments that survive, is that Ivar could not walk or stand unaided. Multiple sources, separated by time and geography, agree on this much, even when they disagree on everything else, which, in the messy world of early medieval history, counts as remarkably strong evidence. Whether carried on a shield by loyal men transported on some kind of litter or platform, or hoisted onto the shoulders of warriors twice his size, Ivar moved through the world differently than any other Viking leader we know of. And that difference, rather than weakening his authority, seems to have done something almost the opposite. It made him strange. It made him memorable. In a warrior culture built on physical dominance, on the visible proof of strength through muscle and scar, here was a man who commanded obedience without ever needing to lift a sword arm to prove it. There's a quirky detail buried in some of the later accounts, the kind of small human moment that rarely survives in the saga's usual parade of battles and body counts. It's said that Ivar was carried into councils on a shield held aloft by his men, seated there like some grim inversion of a king's throne, watching the proceedings from above the heads of everyone else in the room. Whether that detail is historical fact or later embellishment, it captures something true about how his contemporaries seem to have experienced him, not as a broken man to be pitied, but as something elevated, almost otherworldly, watching from a height his legs would never have allowed him to reach on his own. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you in a world that worshipped physical strength above nearly everything else. Ivar didn't try to hide his condition or overcome it through some display of forced normalcy. He built his entire reputation around a different kind of power, instead cold, patient, calculating. The kind of intelligence that plans 3 moves ahead while everyone else is still swinging axes. His brothers had muscle. Ivar had something colder and in the long run far more dangerous. The nickname stuck, and it followed him across the sea into England, into the burning towns and broken kingdoms that were about to become his life's work. Because right now, back on that northern coastline, the ships are nearly loaded, the last of the warriors are climbing aboard, and the boy who could never run is about to sail toward a country that has absolutely no idea what kind of storm is coming for its shores. Before the ships, before the army, before the name Boneless ever meant anything to a single soul outside his own household, there was simply a boy trying to survive childhood in a world that had no patience for weakness. And to understand the warlord, you first have to understand the child, because everything that makes Ivar terrifying later begins right here in a longhouse thick with smoke, surrounded by brothers who could do things he never would. Picture the scene: winter in the north, the fire roaring in the center of the hall, and a group of boys sparring with wooden practice swords in the packed dirt outside. Among them Björn, broad-shouldered even as a youth, already showing the build that will one day earn him the name Ironside. Beside him, Halfdan, quick-tempered and eager, always first to throw a punch, and last to apologize for it. And off to the side, watching rather than participating, sits Ivar, not sulking, not resentful in any obvious way, just watching with an intensity that makes the household's older warriors a little uneasy. Children who cannot join the games usually either fade into the background or grow bitter. Ivar does neither. He studies. Here's what you have to understand about a Viking household of this era: status isn't handed to you, it's proven. Usually through some combination of raiding success, physical dominance, and the ability to hold your own in a hall full of men who measure worth in scars. For most sons of a chieftain, that path is straightforward. If brutal, you fight, you raid, you bleed a little, you earn respect. For Ivar, that entire path is closed off from birth. And so, from a remarkably young age, he has to find another road to the same destination, because in this culture, a son who commands no respect is worse than useless. He's a liability. What he discovers apparently quite early is that information is its own kind of weapon. While his brothers are out testing their strength against each other, Ivar is listening to the older warriors discussing raid strategy over ale, to travelers passing through with news from distant kingdoms, to the subtle political maneuvering that determines which alliances hold and which quietly rot from within. Norse society of this period runs on oral memory. Genealogies, feuds, debts, and obligations are all carried in people's heads, recited and remembered rather than written down, and a sharp mind that can track all of it becomes remarkably valuable, remarkably fast. There's a detail worth sitting with here, one that doesn't often make it into the flashier retellings. Some sources suggest Ivar was known even as a young man for his skill in what the sagas call cunning counsel. essentially strategic advice, the kind of clear-eyed assessment of a situation that cuts through emotion and gets straight to what will actually work. Imagine being a teenager in a hall full of grown warriors and having those warriors occasionally turn to you, the boy who can't stand without help, and ask what you think they should do. That's not pity, that's the beginning of real power. And Ivar seems to have understood exactly how rare and how valuable that kind of respect actually was. His relationship with his father deserves a moment too, because Ragnar Lothbrok is, by every account we have, an enormous personality, restless, ambitious, prone to grand gestures and grander risks, the kind of man who becomes a legend partly because he's constantly doing legendary, reckless things. You might expect a father like that to have little patience for a son who can't join him on raids, who can't be paraded in front of other chieftains as proof of strong bloodlines. But the sources hint at something more complicated. Whether out of genuine affection or simple pragmatism, recognizing useful talent when he saw it, Ragnar appears to have kept Ivar close, included him in councils, valued his read on people and situations, even while his other sons were off proving themselves through combat. And here's a small, almost darkly comic detail that survives in some tellings, apparently in disputes among the brothers. It was often Ivar who ended up settling things, not through strength, obviously, but through arguments so precise and so relentless that his brothers would simply give up rather than keep debating him. Imagine losing every single argument to the one sibling who can't chase you around the hall to make his point. There's something almost merciful about that if you think about it. At least he couldn't catch you afterward. But make no mistake, watching him grow up this way, you start to see the shape of what's coming. Every slight, real or perceived, every moment where his body failed him in front of warriors who could sprint and swing and swim without a second thought, all of it seems to have been quietly filed away, transformed not into self-pity but into fuel. He's not becoming bitter. He's becoming precise. He's learning year after year that the world respects results and that results can come from a mind as easily as they can come from a sword arm. By the time word reaches the household that Ragnar has died in Northumbria, thrown into that pit of serpents on King Ella's orders, Ivar is no longer the fragile boy watching from the sidelines. He is a young man who has spent his entire life turning disadvantage into strategy. And now, for the first time, he has a cause large enough to match the scale of his ambition. His brothers want blood. Ivar wants something more permanent than that. And as the ships begin gathering along the coast, as warriors from distant fjords arrive, drawn by rumor of the scale of what's coming, you start to understand that this was never going to be a simple raid. It was always going to be a reckoning. The ships stretch along the coastline farther than any single glance can take in, and if you stood there in that cold grey morning, you would feel it before you fully understood what you were looking at. Something has changed. This isn't the size of a normal Viking raiding party. This is something else entirely. Here's what you have to understand about most Viking activity. Up to this point in history, raids are by design quick. A handful of longships slip in along a coastline, hit a monastery or a poorly defended village, grab silver grain, sometimes captives, and slip back out before any real resistance can organize. It's opportunistic, violent smash and retreat, rarely an attempt to conquer or hold territory. English kingdoms have dealt with this pattern for decades. They know how to absorb a raid, rebuild a burned monastery, mourn their dead, and move on with life. What they do not know how to handle, what nothing in their recent memory has prepared them for, is an invasion force numbering in the thousands, arriving not to plunder and vanish, but to stay. The chronicles that survive from this period, written by English monks, understandably horrified by what they're witnessing, struggle to even describe the scale of what's assembling. They reach for the word great, almost reflexively, the Great Heathen Army, a name that has stuck for over 1,000 years precisely because nothing else quite captures how unprecedented this felt to the people watching it arrive. Historians still debate the exact numbers involved, and honestly, medieval chroniclers were not known for careful headcounts. especially when describing an enemy they feared and despised. But even accounting for exaggeration, the consistent picture across multiple sources is the same. This is bigger by a wide margin than anything English shores have faced before. What makes this army different isn't just its size, though. It's the fact that warriors from across the Norse world, men who would normally fight for their own chieftains, their own regional loyalties, sometimes even against each other, have been drawn together under a shared banner, pulled by rumour of what Ragnar's sons are planning. Björn, Ironside. Halfdan and Ivar stand at the centre of it, and while the sagas love to frame this entirely as a vengeance mission for their father's death, you should hold that framing a little sceptically. Grief might have lit the spark, but grief alone doesn't organise logistics for an army this size. Someone has to plan how thousands of warriors will be fed, where they'll land, how they'll move once they're on foreign soil. And if you've been paying attention to the boy who spent his childhood listening instead of fighting, you can probably guess who's doing a significant share of that planning. Picture the scene as the fleet finally launches dozens upon dozens of longships, cutting through the grey swell of the North Sea, sails full, oars cutting rhythm into the water, the horizon behind them crowded with more ships than most of these warriors have ever sailed alongside in their lives. The crossing itself is brutal in its own quiet way. No storms in the stories, no shipwrecks worth recording, but days of cold, cramped misery. Salt spray and short rations, men packed shoulder to shoulder with their weapons and their ambitions, and not much else. And somewhere among them, in a place cushioned as best his men can manage, rides Ivar, unable to stand on the pitching deck, entirely dependent on the loyalty of the warriors around him, and yet, by every account, very much still the mind steering where this fleet is actually headed. There's a quirky little detail tucked into some of the later retellings, one worth pausing on for a moment of dark humour before the story turns heavier again, apparently. Some of the younger warriors on that crossing had never actually fought in a real battle before, having joined the fleet purely on reputation and rumour, drawn by promises of land and plunder in a country most of them had only heard about in second-hand stories. Imagine the nerves on that ship. You've left home, crossed a genuinely dangerous stretch of open sea, all based on the promise of a crippled warlord's cousin's friend, swearing this campaign was going to be the one that mattered. And here is the striking historical fact worth sitting with. This invasion arrives at a moment when England itself is dangerously fractured, divided into 4 major kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex, none of which maintain any kind of unified defence, none of which particularly trust each other enough to combine forces even when threatened. It's almost as though the island has been quietly preparing the perfect conditions for exactly this kind of catastrophe. Kingdom after kingdom absorbed in its own rivalries, while a force capable of exploiting every one of those divisions sails steadily closer. As the coastline of East Anglia finally rises out of the mist, low and green and utterly unprepared, you have to wonder what's going through Ivar's mind. Not blind rage, the sagas suggest, not the reckless fury you might expect from a man avenging his father's brutal death. Something colder, something already calculating which kingdom to strike first, which alliances to test, which enemies to let live just a little longer because they'll prove useful later. The ships begin their approach toward the shore, and somewhere on that unsuspecting coastline, English lives are about to change forever, though none of them know it yet. The keel scrapes shallow water, and then it happens. Hundreds of Viking warriors wading ashore onto East Anglian soil, weapons ready, expecting resistance, expecting the kind of chaos that usually greets a landing this size. And here's the twist that catches everyone off guard. English and Norse alike, there isn't one. Not yet. Because the man directing this invasion has no intention of opening with slaughter. You have to picture King Edmund of East Anglia in this moment, receiving word that an enormous foreign fleet has landed on his shores, bracing himself for the kind of devastation every English ruler has heard about in reports from other kingdoms' misfortunes. And instead, what arrives isn't fire and axes, it's a proposal. Ivar, through intermediaries, through whatever combination of translators and go-betweens made cross-cultural negotiation possible in this era, offers Edmund something unexpected: peace in exchange for horses and supplies. Just that. Not East Anglia's crown, not its treasury emptied, not its churches burned to the ground. Horses, food, and safe passage through his territory. And here is what you have to understand about why this matters so much. Ivar's army arrived by sea, which means every warrior in that force is currently on foot, in unfamiliar territory hundreds of miles from home, with no cavalry. No way to move quickly across the English countryside. Horses solve that problem entirely. Edmund, faced with a fleet of thousands sitting on his coastline, does what any reasonable ruler under that kind of pressure would do. He agrees. He hands over horses, supplies the invading army, and in exchange watches them march peacefully through his kingdom rather than burn it. From Edmund's perspective in this moment, this probably feels like a diplomatic victory, a crisis narrowly avoided through careful negotiation. He has no way of knowing that what he's actually done is arm the very force that will, years from now, come back to destroy him personally in a way that will echo through English history for centuries. There's something almost unsettling about how patient this is, isn't there? You'd expect a man driven by vengeance for his father's brutal death to want blood immediately, to want East Anglia burning within days of landing. Instead, Ivar is playing a longer game entirely, one where East Anglia becomes not a target but a staging ground, a source of the mobility his infantry-heavy force desperately needs before the real campaign even begins. Historians still debate exactly how deliberate and how far ahead this planning extended, whether Ivar always intended eventual conquest or whether the strategy evolved as opportunities presented themselves. But even the most cautious readings agree on this. Whatever is happening here, it's calculated, and it's patient in a way that should genuinely unnerve you if you're an English king watching from a neighbouring kingdom. And here's a quirky detail that adds a strange, almost domestic texture to this moment of high political tension. The horses that Edmund provides likely include not just war mounts, but pack animals, breeding stock, whatever East Anglia's stables could supply on relatively short notice. Picture Norse warriors, most of them lifelong sailors and raiders, suddenly having to learn or relearn how to ride. How to manage English horses bred for entirely different terrain and climate than what they're used to back home. There's an almost comic image buried in the historical record here. Thousands of hardened Viking warriors, some of them presumably terrible riders, stumbling through their first weeks on horseback in a foreign country, all under the watchful, patient direction of a commander who himself will never sit a horse the way they do, who travels a completely different way entirely. Because remember, through all of this negotiation and preparation, Ivar himself is still being carried on a litter on a shield. However, his men manage it, directing a mounted army he will never personally ride with in the conventional sense. There's something worth sitting with in that image, an army gaining the mobility of cavalry, led by a man who will always move at the pace his body allows, and who somehow makes that limitation completely irrelevant to how effectively he commands. Meanwhile, word of what's happening in East Anglia begins spreading to the neighbouring kingdoms, and you can imagine the uneasy conversations happening in royal halls across England. Northumbria, in particular, should be paying close attention, because Northumbria is where Ela rules the very king. The sagas claim ordered Ragnar's death in that pit of serpents. If there's any truth to the vengeance narrative driving this invasion at all, Northumbria is not just another kingdom in Ivar's path. It's the destination the entire campaign has been quietly building towards since before the ships ever left the northern coast. But Northumbria, like East Anglia before it, has no idea what's actually coming. It has heard vague reports of a large Viking force landing somewhere to the south, has perhaps assumed the way people often do with distant threats, that this is someone else's problem to worry about. Northumbria is currently consumed by its own internal crisis, entirely unrelated to Vikings, a bitter succession dispute that has split the kingdom's loyalty between two rival claimants to the throne, weakening its ability to respond to any external threat at exactly the wrong moment. As autumn deepens and Ivar's newly mobile army finishes its preparations in East Anglia. The horses gathered, the supply lines secured. You can feel the story's center of gravity beginning to shift northward. Edmund breathes a temporary sigh of relief, believing his kingdom has escaped the worst of it. He has no idea that this is merely a delay, not a resolution, because Ivar the Boneless has just gained exactly what he needed, and Northumbria, fractured, distracted, utterly unprepared, is about to learn precisely why patience in the hands of the right commander can be far more dangerous than rage. The horses are ready, the supplies secured, and now the great heathen army turns north, toward a kingdom that has absolutely no idea it's about to become the center of the entire story. Northumbria, sprawling and proud, one of the oldest and most storied of the English kingdoms, is currently tearing itself apart from the inside, and Ivar knows it. Here's what you have to understand about Northumbria in this exact moment. The kingdom is caught in the middle of a brutal succession crisis, split between two rival claimants to the throne. Ella, the man the sagas remember as Ragnar's executioner, has seized power, but his claim to the crown is disputed by Osbert, a former king who was pushed out and who still commands loyalty from a significant portion of the nobility. This is precisely the kind of fractured, distracted, internally hostile situation that Ivar has apparently been patient enough to wait for, and precise enough to exploit the moment it presents itself. Picture the city of York in this period, not the York of later centuries, but Eoforwick as it's known, a walled settlement that serves as Northumbria's political and religious heart, home to churches, markets, and the uneasy remnants of a once unified kingdom's authority. It is autumn when the great heathen army arrives outside its walls, and the timing could not be worse for the city's defenders. York falls with startling speed. Some accounts suggest the city's defences simply weren't prepared for a force of this size and coordination. Others suggest that the ongoing civil war had left the garrison thin, distracted, unwilling to fully commit to a fight that felt secondary to their internal power struggle. Either way, by the time anyone in York fully grasps the scale of what's happening, the Viking army is already inside the walls. And here's where something remarkable happens. Something that should genuinely surprise you if you've been assuming Northumbria's two rival kings would keep fighting each other even with a foreign army at the gates. Ella and Osbert, bitter enemies just weeks earlier, realize that a common threat now outweighs their private feud, and they do the one thing that might have saved their kingdom if they'd done it months earlier. They unite their forces and march to retake York. You have to sit with the tragic irony of that timing for a moment. If these two men had set aside their rivalry even a season sooner, if Northumbria had faced this invasion with a unified command and undivided loyalty, the entire outcome of this campaign might have looked completely different. Instead, their reconciliation comes exactly when it's least useful, too late to prevent the fall of their capital, just in time to throw both of their lives away trying to reclaim it. The battle that follows, fought at York in the early months of the year, is chaotic and brutal in a way the sparse chronicle entries can only hint at. The combined Northumbrian force actually manages to breach the city's defences initially, pushing into the streets, gaining ground that must have felt for a few desperate hours like it might actually work. But the Viking army, better organised, likely more experienced in exactly this kind of close, brutal urban fighting, turns the tide. What began as a Northumbrian counterattack collapses into a slaughter. Both Ella and Osbert die in the fighting, and here is where the story splits into two very different tracks. The plain historical record, and the version the sagas will tell for centuries afterward. The straightforward chronicle sources simply record that both kings were killed in battle, one casualty among many in a chaotic engagement. The kind of death that happens to plenty of medieval rulers who lead from the front and lose. That's it. That's the sober version. But the saga tradition tells a very different story about Ella's death, specifically one dripping with ritual and vengeance. claiming that Ella wasn't simply killed in the fighting, but was captured alive and subjected to something far more elaborate and deliberate, a punishment designed specifically to answer for what he'd allegedly done to Ragnar. We'll dig into exactly what that supposed punishment involved very soon, because it's become one of the most infamous, most disputed images in all of Viking Age history, and honestly, the debate over whether it happened at all still splits historians right down the middle. There's a darkly ironic detail worth pausing on here, a small piece of dry historical comedy buried in the tragedy Osbert. The former king, who spent years fighting Ella for the throne, dies fighting alongside him in the exact battle that was supposed to reclaim the kingdom they'd been squabbling over. Two men who couldn't share a crown in peace ended up sharing a battlefield grave. With both rival kings dead and York firmly in Viking hands, Northumbria is effectively leaderless, its capital occupied, its political structure shattered in the span of a single catastrophic season. The great heathen army installs a puppet ruler, a local man willing to govern under Viking oversight in exchange for his own survival, and just like that, one of England's oldest kingdoms has become, in practical terms, a client state. And somewhere amid the ashes and the aftermath, Ivar the Boneless watches the pieces fall exactly where he needed them to fall. Ragnar's supposed killer dead, Northumbria broken, and the rest of England still not fully grasping how close the danger has already come to their own doorsteps. But the question of exactly how Ella died and whether vengeance took the horrifying ritualized form the sagas describe is a story too dark and too disputed to rush through here. That's where we're headed next. You were promised the truth about what happened to Ella, and here it is. Though truth might be exactly the wrong word for a story this tangled in legend ritual, and 13 centuries of storytellers embellishing every retelling, this is the moment the sagas have been building toward since the very first section of tonight's journey, and it's every bit as dark as you'd expect. Picture the scene the sagas describe Ella defeated, captured, rather than killed outright in the chaos of the York battlefield, brought before Ragnar's sons Ivar, among them as a prisoner facing men who have waited years for exactly this moment. According to certain later Norse sources, what follows isn't a quick execution. It's ritual, it's deliberate symbolic, meant to be witnessed and remembered rather than simply carried out and forgotten. The sagas call it the Blood Eagle, and the description involves the victim's ribs being severed from the spine and spread outward, meant to resemble wings, an offering. Some accounts claim to Odin himself. Now here is where you absolutely need to pump the brakes with me, because this is one of the most genuinely contested topics in the entire field of Viking Age scholarship, and any storyteller who presents it to you as settled fact isn't being honest with you. Historians still argue fiercely over whether the Blood Eagle was ever a real practice at all, or whether it's a literary invention, born generations after these events, added by saga writers who were far more interested in a dramatic, symbolically rich vengeance narrative than in recording what actually happened on a 9th century battlefield. Consider the evidence problem here. The earliest sources describing Ella's death, the ones closest in time to the actual events, simply say he died in battle. No ritual, no ribs, no wings, just a king killed fighting to reclaim his capital. The kind of death that happened to plenty of rulers in this violent era. It's only in later sources, written well over a century after Ivar's lifetime, compiled by saga authors, working within a storytelling tradition that loved elaborate, almost theatrical acts of vengeance, that the Blood Eagle description first appears in detail. That gap matters enormously. A century of oral retelling, passed hall to hall, poet to poet, gives a story enormous room to grow, more vivid, more symbolic, more satisfying as narrative, even as it drifts further from whatever actually happened. And here's an angle worth sitting with, one that doesn't get discussed nearly often enough. Some scholars have proposed that the entire image might stem from a kind of poetic misreading, where an earlier verse describing an eagle tearing at a corpse on a battlefield, a fairly common and grim battle image in Norse poetry, eagles and ravens feeding on the dead, being a standard, almost formulaic way of describing carnage, was later reinterpreted literally by saga writers, transformed from a metaphor about scavenger birds into an actual described ritual performed on a living victim. If that theory holds any water, then the blood eagle might be in a strange way the result of poetry taken too literally by a later generation who wanted their hero's vengeance to look as dramatic on the page as it felt in their imaginations. Other historians push back on that skepticism, arguing that ritualized, symbolically loaded executions weren't foreign to the broader culture of this era, and that dismissing the blood eagle entirely as pure invention might be underestimating just how theatrical and deliberately brutal Viking Age vengeance culture could actually be. The debate genuinely isn't settled and probably never will be given how thin and contradictory the surviving evidence is. What we can say with more confidence is this: regardless of whether the ritual happened exactly as later sagas describe it, the story itself became enormously important to how Ivar and his brothers were remembered. Whether it's historical fact or later legend, the blood eagle narrative served a purpose for the storytellers who preserved it. It transformed a fairly ordinary battlefield death into a satisfying, almost mythic act of closure, proof that Ragnar's sons had not just defeated their father's killer, but had answered his death with something equally symbolic, equally severe. There's a quirky, almost uncomfortable detail worth noting here too: the blood eagle, real or invented, has had an outsized afterlife in popular culture, showing up in television dramas and novels centuries later, often depicted with far more visual detail and dramatic flourish than any actual medieval source ever provides. In a strange way, modern storytellers have been doing exactly what those 13th century saga writers were doing, taking a story about Ella's death and shaping it into whatever version serves the narrative best. For Ivar specifically, whether or not he personally ordered or participated in anything resembling this ritual, the association stuck to his legend permanently. He becomes, in the popular imagination, not just a clever strategist, but something colder and more frightening. A man capable of a level of calculated, ritualized cruelty that goes beyond ordinary battlefield violence, and whether that reputation is fully earned or largely the invention of later storytellers eager for a good ending, it follows him into everything that comes next. Because Northumbria, however Ella actually died, is now firmly broken, and Ivar's army isn't finished. There's a whole country still ahead of them, and the next kingdom in their path is about to discover exactly how far south this campaign is prepared to reach. With Northumbria broken and a puppet ruler installed to keep the region quiet, the great heathen army doesn't linger to enjoy its victory. That's not how this campaign has worked so far, and it isn't how it's going to work now. Barely has the dust settled over York before the army is moving again, this time south and west toward the kingdom of Mercia. Here's what you have to understand about Mercia's position in this moment. It's one of the most powerful kingdoms in England, historically dominant over much of the Midlands, with a king, Burgred, who has watched the fall of Northumbria with the kind of dread that comes from realizing your neighbour's disaster might soon become your own. Mercia hasn't been directly attacked yet, but word travels fast in a country this small and this interconnected, and by the time the great heathen army starts moving toward Mercian territory, Burgred already knows roughly what he's facing. An army that took a divided, distracted kingdom apart in a matter of months, still flush with momentum, still hungry for more. The army makes camp at Nottingham, deep in Mercian territory. And here Ivar's approach reveals something consistent about how this campaign actually operates. Something that separates it from the popular image most people carry of Vikings as purely chaotic raiders. This isn't random destruction. It's methodical pressure applied with enough visible force to make resistance look catastrophically costly, but without necessarily requiring a full-pitched battle every single time. Burgred, watching an enormous, battle-hardened army settle into a fortified position inside his own kingdom, does what East Anglia's Edmund did before him. He looks for a way out that doesn't involve losing everything. Mercia, unlike East Anglia, doesn't stand entirely alone in this moment, and this is worth pausing on, because it shows you something about how English kingdoms are slowly, painfully beginning to grasp the scale of the threat they're facing. Burgred appeals to Wessex for help, and Wessex actually responds, sending forces north to support Mercia against the Viking army at Nottingham. For a brief moment, you can almost feel a flicker of what unified English resistance might have looked like if it had come together sooner. If Northumbria's rival kings had managed this kind of cooperation before their kingdom collapsed instead of after. But here's the thing about that combined Mercian and West Saxon force: despite gathering at Nottingham, despite having genuine numbers and genuine motivation, no decisive battle actually happens. The armies essentially face off, each side apparently unwilling to commit to the kind of full engagement that could end catastrophically. And the standoff eventually resolves not through combat but through negotiation. Burgred, rather than risk his kingdom's entire military in an uncertain battle, agrees to pay the Viking army off, buying peace the same way Edmund did in East Anglia. There's something almost dryly funny in a grim sort of way about how consistently this pattern repeats itself. You'd think English kings would eventually stop believing that paying off an invading army guarantees lasting peace, and yet here's Burgred, watching Northumbria's fate play out in vivid recent detail, choosing to believe that his kingdom will somehow be different, that this payment will actually be the end of it, rather than simply another delay before the inevitable return. Historians studying this pattern across multiple English kingdoms have noted just how often this exact same mistake gets repeated: tribute, treated as resolution rather than what it actually is, which is simply time purchased at a price that keeps climbing. What's genuinely striking about the Nottingham standoff, though, is what it reveals about Ivar's calculated restraint. This is a moment where the great heathen army, fresh off conquering an entire kingdom, faces a combined force from two of England's remaining powerful kingdoms, and rather than pushing for total victory, the army accepts payment and withdraws. That's not the behavior of a force driven purely by bloodlust or reckless momentum. That's the behavior of a commander thinking several moves ahead, someone willing to take a guaranteed gain now, rather than risk everything on an uncertain battle that might weaken his army right when he needs it intact for what comes next. There's a quirky detail from this period worth noting, one that adds a strange, almost mundane texture to an otherwise tense standoff. The peace agreement struck at Nottingham reportedly involved not just an immediate payment but ongoing arrangements, suggesting these negotiations were becoming increasingly sophisticated, almost bureaucratic in nature, as both sides settled into a grim rhythm of conflict and negotiated pause. Viking armies, often imagined purely as chaotic raiders, were apparently becoming remarkably practiced at extracting structured, repeatable tribute arrangements from the kingdoms they threatened. The great heathen army withdraws from Nottingham with Mercia's payment secured, its reputation for both military strength and calculated restraint now cemented across yet another English kingdom. And here's the open question hanging over everything as this section closes with Northumbria broken and Mercia bought off. Only two major targets remain on the board: East Anglia, whose earlier peaceful arrangement with Ivar was always going to be temporary, and Wessex, the one kingdom that has yet to fully feel the weight of this invasion firsthand. Something in the way this campaign has unfolded so far tells you that patience like this doesn't last forever, and that East Anglia in particular, having once bought its safety with horses rather than blood, is about to discover exactly how temporary that safety really was. Remember East Anglia, the kingdom that once bought peace with horses, the deal that gave Ivar's army the mobility it needed to crush Northumbria and pressure Mercia into submission. That arrangement was always a loan, not a gift. And now, with the rest of England reeling and the great heathen army's reputation for both patience and brutality thoroughly established, the bill is finally coming due. Picture King Edmund in this moment, ruling over a kingdom that has enjoyed a strange kind of borrowed peace for several years now, watching from the relative safety of his own borders as Northumbria fell and Mercia bought its way out of catastrophe. You have to imagine there was some quiet hope in Edmund's court that East Anglia's earlier cooperation, the horses and supplies handed over so readily, might have purchased something more lasting than temporary safety. That hope is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The great heathen army turns back toward East Anglia in force, and this time there's no diplomatic opening offer, no negotiation over horses and supplies. The strategic calculus that made peace useful the first time around simply doesn't apply anymore. Back then, Ivar's army needed mobility and was willing to trade peace for it. Now, with years of successful campaigning behind them, with Northumbria already functioning as a client territory and Mercia paying tribute, the great heathen army doesn't need anything East Anglia has to offer through negotiation. It needs East Anglia's submission, full and complete. And this time, that's exactly what it intends to take. Here's what you have to understand about how dramatically the situation has shifted from East Anglia's perspective. The kingdom that once negotiated from a position of relative strength, offering resources in exchange for safe passage, now finds itself facing an enemy that has spent years growing more experienced, more entrenched, more confident with every English kingdom it's subdued. Edmund's forces, whatever their quality, to have not been tested against this army the way Northumbria's were, and they're about to discover firsthand just how much more dangerous this force has become since it last passed peacefully through their territory. The invasion moves swiftly once it begins. Towns and settlements falling under Viking control with a speed that suggests East Anglia's defences were never remotely prepared for a full assault, having spent years assuming their earlier arrangement had brought lasting security. There's a bitter irony worth sitting with here. The same horses and supplies East Anglia handed over years earlier likely contributed directly to the efficiency and mobility of the very army now conquering their kingdom. Edmund, in trying to protect his people through diplomacy, may have inadvertently armed the force that would eventually destroy everything he was trying to protect. As Viking forces push deeper into East Anglian territory, Edmund faces the kind of impossible decision that has confronted rulers throughout history. When facing an overwhelming enemy, whether to gather what forces remain and make a stand, knowing the odds are grim, or to seek some kind of accommodation. However unlikely that seems, given how thoroughly the diplomatic option has already been exhausted. The historical record here grows frustratingly thin. The kind of gap that leaves modern readers wishing desperately for more detail than the surviving chronicles actually provide. What we know is that East Anglian resistance, wherever and however it was mounted, ultimately fails to stop the Viking advance. There's a strange, quietly unsettling detail worth noting about this campaign compared to Ivar's earlier operations, where the assault on Northumbria involved a chaotic battle at York, with two rival kings dying in the confusion of urban combat. The conquest of East Anglia reads in the surviving sources as somehow more controlled, more inevitable, almost administrative in how thoroughly and efficiently it unfolds. This isn't a campaign fighting for survival against determined resistance. It's a campaign methodically claiming territory that has, in practical terms, already been softened up by years of prior involvement in the region. And here's where the story is about to take its darkest turn, yet one that will define how Edmund is remembered for the next 12 centuries, transforming a defeated king into something England will eventually canonize as a saint. Because Edmund's fate, once he falls into Viking hands, becomes one of the most infamous individual deaths in the entire history of the Viking invasions of England. A death so brutal, so specific in its details, that it will echo through English religious tradition long after the political consequences of this campaign have faded from memory. We're not there yet. Right now, East Anglian resistance is crumbling. Viking forces are consolidating control across the kingdom's territory. And somewhere amid the chaos, King Edmund is running out of options, running out of allies, running out of time. The kingdom that once thought it had brought lasting peace is about to learn in the most brutal way imaginable exactly how temporary that peace really was and exactly what price Ivar's patience ultimately demands from those who mistake it for mercy. Here it is, the moment East Anglia's story has been building towards since Edmund first handed over horses in exchange for temporary peace. This is the death that will transform a defeated king into a saint, the moment that English religious memory will preserve far more vividly than almost anything else from this entire campaign. Picture Edmund in these final days, a king whose kingdom has fallen apart around him, whose military options have essentially evaporated, facing capture by an army that has already demonstrated in Northumbria and elsewhere exactly how little mercy it extends to defeated rulers. The precise circumstances of his capture are frustratingly thin in the surviving record, the way so much of this era remains frustratingly thin. But what happens next becomes, over the following decades and centuries, one of the most detailed and most widely retold individual deaths in all of Anglo-Saxon history. According to the tradition that develops around Edmund's death, recorded most famously by a monk named Abbo of Fleury, writing roughly a century after the events themselves, drawing on testimony he claimed came from Edmund's own sword-bearer, the Viking forces who capture Edmund offer him a choice: submit, renounce his position, become a subordinate ruler under Viking authority, and live, or refuse and face the consequences of that refusal. And here is where Edmund's story takes on the shape that will define his legacy for the next 12 centuries. Rather than submit, rather than accept survival at the cost of his authority and in the framing that religious writers would emphasize, at the cost of compromising his Christian kingship, Edmund refuses. He will not bow, whatever the practical wisdom of that choice, and there are certainly those who might question whether a private survival wouldn't have served his people better than a defiant death. The tradition surrounding Edmund frames this refusal as an act of profound faith and courage, the kind of stand that transforms a political defeat into something closer to religious martyrdom. What follows, according to the accounts that survive, is brutal. Edmund is bound, beaten, and ultimately killed in a manner that later tradition describes, with the specific, almost ritualistic detail of arrows struck repeatedly until, as the imagery is often described in later religious art and writing, his body resembled something pierced through with more shafts than could easily be counted. An image that becomes iconic in medieval religious depictions of his martyrdom. Whether every detail of this account reflects historical accuracy, or whether, like so much surrounding this entire campaign, it has been shaped and dramatized by generations of religious storytelling, eager to elevate Edmund's death into something worthy of sainthood, is genuinely difficult to determine, given how much time separates the earliest full account from the actual events. Here's what you have to understand about why this distinction matters, though beyond simple historical accuracy. Edmund's death, regardless of its exact details, becomes enormously significant to how the English understood and processed this entire era of Viking invasion. A defeated, humiliated kingdom needed a story that gave meaning to its suffering, and a martyred king, killed for refusing to abandon his faith and his people even in the face of certain death, provided exactly that kind of meaning. Edmund becomes not just a casualty of Viking conquest, but a symbol of resistance, faith, and sacrifice. And within a remarkably short time after his death, a cult grows around his memory. There's a quirky detail worth noting here that tells you something about how quickly and thoroughly this transformation happened. Within decades of his death, a town grows up around what becomes his shrine, eventually taking his name entirely, Bury St. Edmunds. A place that still exists today, still carries his memory in its very name. Nearly 12 centuries after a defeated East Anglian king refused to bow to a Viking army. Few individual deaths from this entire period leave a legacy quite that literal, quite that permanently stamped onto the English landscape itself. And here's the question worth sitting with as this section closes: where was Ivar himself during all of this? The sources are frustratingly vague on his direct personal involvement in Edmund's specific death, and some historians have pointed out that the leadership of the East Anglian campaign at this particular stage may have shifted somewhat, with other commanders potentially taking a more direct role in these final operations. Whether Ivar personally ordered Edmund's execution or whether it was carried out under someone else's direct command within the broader Viking coalition remains genuinely uncertain. But regardless of the specific chain of command in this moment, the campaign that ends with Edmund's death is fundamentally the campaign Ivar built. The momentum he created, the pattern of conquest he established across kingdom after kingdom. East Anglia's king is dead, canonized in memory, if not yet in official religious practice, his kingdom now firmly fallen. And with Northumbria broken, Mercia paying tribute, and East Anglia conquered outright, something remarkable and terrifying has happened in the span of just a few short years. 3 of England's 4 major kingdoms have been humbled, subdued, or destroyed entirely. Only Wessex remains untouched by direct conquest, and somewhere in the chaos of East Anglia's collapse, Ivar's power has reached a peak that even he, watching from his litter as his army marched from victory to victory, might not have imagined possible when those ships first left the northern coast. With Edmund dead and East Anglia's resistance shattered, you're looking at a kingdom that no longer has any real centre of gravity left to organise around. This isn't like Northumbria, where a puppet ruler could be installed to maintain some illusion of continuity for the local population. East Anglia's king is gone, killed in a manner already being whispered about as martyrdom, and the practical machinery of governing this territory now falls, whether by design or simple default, into Viking hands far more directly than it did further north. Picture the landscape in the aftermath: churches that survived the initial conquest now operating under uncertain new authority, local nobility scrambling to figure out where their loyalty and, more urgently, their survival now lies, and ordinary farmers and craftsmen simply trying to continue their lives under an occupying force that shows no immediate sign of departing. This is the texture of conquest that the sagas, focused as they are on battles and vengeance and dramatic individual deaths, tend to skip over almost entirely the slow, grinding reality of what happens to a population after the fighting stops and the occupation begins. Here's what you have to understand about the strategic picture at this exact moment, because it's worth pausing to actually take stock of what's been accomplished. Of England's 4 major kingdoms, Northumbria has fallen entirely, its rival kings dead, a client ruler installed under Viking oversight. Mercia has been humbled without being conquered outright, paying tribute to keep the great heathen army at bay, though everyone involved surely understands that arrangement is more of a pause than a resolution. East Anglia, the kingdom that once negotiated from relative strength, now lies fully conquered, its king dead, its territory effectively absorbed into whatever expanding sphere of control this Viking coalition is building. Only Wessex, tucked in the south and west, remains genuinely untested by direct large-scale conflict with this particular army. Think about the scale of what's happened here in just a handful of years. An invasion that began with a nickname most English rulers probably dismissed as some kind of insult. Some crippled warlord leading a raiding party that would surely behave like every other Viking raid before its smash grab. Retreat has instead methodically dismantled 3/4 of England's political structure. And at the centre of that transformation, directing strategy from a litter he cannot walk away from, sits a man whose own body has never once carried him into the battles that made all of this possible. There's something worth sitting with here, a moment of genuine reflection before the story's momentum carries us forward again. This is very likely the peak. Not necessarily the peak of Ivar's personal power specifically, since his story still has chapters left to unfold, but arguably the peak of unified Viking dominance over English territory under this particular campaign. This particular coalition of brothers and warriors who sailed together from that northern coastline all those years ago. Historians studying the great heathen army's trajectory have noted that this moment roughly marks something of a hinge point, where the campaign's remarkable early momentum begins to face the harder, messier questions of what comes after conquest. How do you actually hold and govern territory this vast, this culturally different from your homeland, with an army that was originally built for conquest rather than administration? And here's a striking historical fact worth citing: with the sheer speed of this conquest, genuinely startled contemporaries both Viking and English, and it would go on to fundamentally reshape the political map of England for generations, laying groundwork for what later becomes known as the Danelaw, a vast swath of eastern and northern England that would operate under Scandinavian law and custom for decades to come. Its influence lingering in place, names, legal traditions, and cultural memory that persists even now, well over 1,000 years later, if you know where to look for it in the English countryside. There's a quirky detail worth including here too, a small human moment amid all this sweeping political transformation. Some of the Viking warriors who fought their way across Northumbria and East Anglia over these years apparently began settling rather than simply raiding, taking English land, in some cases apparently taking English wives, planting the beginnings of communities that would blend Norse and Anglo-Saxon culture in ways that outlasted the military campaign itself by centuries. Conquest, it turns out, has a way of becoming something quieter and more permanent than the battles that made it possible. But here's the shadow hanging over this moment of apparent triumph. The question that should be nagging at you even as you take in the scale of what's been accomplished. An army this large, drawn from warriors with competing loyalties and ambitions, held together as much by shared success and plunder as by any deep unified purpose, doesn't necessarily stay unified forever. Conquest creates its own pressures, questions about how spoils get divided, about who governs what, about whether the brothers who led this campaign together still see their futures pointed in the same direction. And somewhere in the midst of this peak, whispers are beginning, quiet ones at first, questioning whether the man who has orchestrated all of this triumph from a litter carried on other men's shoulders can continue holding together a coalition this vast, this ambitious forever. Power, as history keeps proving over and over again, is often hardest to hold on to at the exact moment it looks most secure. Let's slow down for a moment and actually look closely at something the story has been circling around since the very beginning. Something worth examining directly, rather than simply mentioning in passing. How exactly does a man who cannot walk, cannot ride, cannot stand unaided in a shield wall, actually command an army this size across years of brutal campaigning? Because this is the part of Ivar's story that genuinely defies easy explanation, and it's worth sitting inside it rather than rushing past. Picture the scene at the height of a battlefield, warriors clashing, chaos and noise and blood in every direction, and somewhere behind the front lines, or perhaps carried to a vantage point where he can actually observe what's unfolding, sits Ivar elevated, according to several accounts, on a shield borne by loyal men, watching a battle he will never personally join, with a sword in his own hand. There's something almost eerie about that image, if you really let yourself picture it. In a warrior culture that measures a man's worth so heavily through personal combat prowess, through scars earned and enemies personally cut down, here is a commander whose entire military reputation rests on something else entirely, something his contemporaries would have found genuinely strange and in some ways unsettling to reconcile. Here's what you have to understand about how command actually worked in this era, though, because it helps explain how someone in Ivar's position could function so effectively despite what looks on the surface like an obvious disqualifying weakness. Viking Age warfare, particularly at the scale the Great Heathen Army operated on, it wasn't purely about a single leader's personal combat skill. It required coordination among multiple warbands, strategic decisions about where and when to strike, negotiation with local rulers, management of supplies and logistics across unfamiliar territory, and the kind of political calculation that determines whether an army holds together or fractures under pressure. These are all things a mind can do regardless of what a body can or cannot manage, and by every indication in the sources, Ivar's mind was exceptionally even, unusually well suited to exactly this kind of work. Think about the physical mechanics of it for a moment. The actual logistics of moving a man who cannot walk across the length and breadth of England during an active military campaign, through mud and forest and river crossings in every kind of weather this climate could throw at an army. This required not just personal loyalty from the men tasked with carrying and transporting him, but genuine trust that they wouldn't simply abandon him in a moment of chaos. Trust that his safety mattered enough to the broader campaign that resources would to be devoted to it, even when speed or convenience might have suggested otherwise. That kind of trust doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen through fear alone. It suggests something about how genuinely valuable his strategic mind was considered by the warriors around him, valuable enough that protecting it, quite literally carrying it from battlefield to battlefield, was worth the very real practical burden involved. There's a detail here worth pausing on, one that captures something almost darkly funny about how this dynamic might have actually looked in practice. Imagine being one of the warriors assigned to carry Ivar's litter or shield during a rapid retreat or a chaotic repositioning under pressure, responsible not just for your own survival, but for physically transporting your commander through danger while he continues issuing calm, precise instructions the entire time. That's an enormous amount of trust and pressure resting on a handful of specific men, and the sources suggest this wasn't a one-time arrangement, but a sustained, ongoing part of how this army functioned across years of campaigning. And here's the striking historical fact worth sitting with, one that genuinely sets Ivar apart even within the unusual context of Viking Age leadership. There's no clear parallel in the broader historical record of this era for a commander with this specific combination of physical limitation and sustained, effective battlefield authority operating at this scale. Other cultures across history have certainly had rulers or generals who directed campaigns without personally fighting, but the specific image of a physically disabled commander being carried into and around active combat zones, maintaining authority over warriors who could, in theory, simply have chosen to follow someone else, is genuinely rare in the surviving record. Some historians have suggested that Ivar's condition, rather than purely being an obstacle he overcame, may have actually contributed something specific to his reputation and authority, the sheer strangeness of it. The way it set him visibly apart from every other warlord operating in this era may have fed into a kind of mystique, an aura that made him seem less like an ordinary rival chieftain and more like something else entirely, something worth following precisely because he didn't fit the expected mold. Whether that's giving too much credit to reputation and mystique over pure strategic competence is, like so much else in this story, genuinely up for debate. But here's the quirky, almost darkly comic detail worth ending on for all the mystique and reputation, for all the careful management of trust and loyalty required to keep this arrangement functioning. There's no escaping the fact that Ivar's authority ultimately depended every single day on other men's willingness to literally carry him where he needed to go. That's an extraordinary kind of vulnerability sitting right at the center of an extraordinary kind of power. And as this campaign stretches on, as the pressures of holding together conquered territory begin to mount, that vulnerability is about to become far more relevant than it's ever been before. Every arrangement built on trust carries a hidden fault line, and the longer a campaign like this stretches on, the more that fault line has time to show itself. What started as unquestioning loyalty among warriors who'd sailed together from the northern coast is now, years into a brutal and increasingly complicated campaign, beginning to strain under pressures that victory itself has created. Here's what you have to understand about the position Ivar occupies at this stage. He has spent years proving that his mind is worth more than any single warrior's sword arm, that strategy and patience can accomplish what raw physical dominance alone never could. But conquest once achieved requires a different kind of leadership than the campaign that won it, and that shift exposes vulnerabilities that pure military success had, until now kept comfortably hidden, Picture the warbands that make up the broader Great Heathen Army in this period, not a single unified force under one absolute commander, but a coalition, warriors and sub-leaders who joined this campaign from different regions, different loyalties, drawn together as much by the promise of plunder and land as by any deep personal devotion to Ragnar's sons specifically. That distinction matters enormously now. In the earliest days of the invasion, when victories came fast and rewards flowed freely, holding a coalition like this together was relatively easy. Success has a way of smoothing over doubts, but as the campaign matures, as conquered territory needs actual governing rather than simple plundering, as decisions have to be made about how spoils get divided and who controls what, cracks start appearing in ways that raw battlefield success can no longer paper over. And here's where Ivar's specific situation becomes genuinely precarious in a way it wasn't before. Whispers begin quiet at first, the kind of doubt that spreads in low conversations around campfires rather than open challenges. In a war council, questions about whether a commander who cannot personally lead a charge, who must be carried everywhere, who will never physically intimidate a rival the way Björn Ironside's sheer size does, can hold authority over an increasingly restless and diverse coalition once the easy victories stop coming quite so easily. It's a cruel irony worth sitting with the very quality that made Ivar's rise so remarkable. His ability to command entirely through intellect rather than physical presence becomes exactly the vulnerability that ambitious rivals start probing at once circumstances get more complicated. You have to imagine what this feels like from the inside, though the sources frustratingly give us almost nothing of Ivar's interior emotional life at any point in this story. Still consider the position. A man who has spent his entire life proving over and over that his body's limitations don't define what he's capable of, now facing exactly the kind of doubt he thought he'd permanently silenced through years of undeniable spectacular success. If those whispers are reaching him, and it's difficult to imagine they wouldn't have, they represent a return of the exact anxiety that shaped his entire childhood. The fear of being underestimated, dismissed, quietly pushed aside by men who trust muscle over mind. Here's a genuine scholarly debate worth raising, because historians studying this period are honestly divided on how much internal fracturing actually contributed to what happens next in Ivar's story. Some argue that tension within the Great Heathen Army's leadership was a significant, perhaps even decisive factor in the changes that follow. That rival ambitions among the various warlords who joined this coalition created pressure that specifically affected Ivar's position and made his continued involvement in the English campaign increasingly untenable. Others push back on that reading, suggesting the surviving evidence is simply too thin to support such a specific narrative of internal power struggle, and that what happens next might be better explained by opportunity elsewhere rather than pressure at home. There's a quirky detail worth noting amid this tension, one that adds a strange, almost darkly comic texture to the political maneuvering happening beneath the surface. Some later sources suggest that certain warbands within the broader coalition had already begun operating with increasing independence, pursuing their own campaigns and priorities somewhat separately from the unified strategy that had characterized the invasion's earlier years, essentially freelancing within what was nominally still a shared campaign. Imagine trying to hold together a partnership where half your partners have quietly started running their own side businesses while still technically showing up to the same meetings. And here's the striking historical fact worth sitting with as this tension builds: the Great Heathen Army, for all its early unified momentum, never really operated as a single centralized state with one unquestioned ruler, and that structural looseness, which had actually been a strength during the fast-moving conquest years, becomes a genuine liability once questions of long-term governance and leadership legitimacy start mattering more than raw battlefield success. What's clear, whatever the precise mixture of internal politics, rival ambition, and external opportunity actually driving events, is that something is shifting. The campaign that once moved with such relentless, coordinated purpose is beginning to fragment at least a little, at the edges. And Ivar, the man whose entire career has been built on staying several moves ahead of everyone around him, is about to make a decision that will genuinely puzzle chroniclers and historians alike for the next 12 centuries. A departure so sudden, so quietly recorded that it leaves more questions than answers about exactly what drove him away from the campaign he built. And then quite suddenly he's simply gone. That's genuinely the most honest way to describe what happens next, because the surviving chronicles, so detailed in places about battles and kings and betrayals, go strangely, frustratingly quiet at exactly the moment you'd most want them to explain themselves. Ivar the Boneless, the man whose strategic mind built and directed the conquest of 3 English kingdoms, simply stops appearing in the English record. No dramatic final battle described, no clear account of a falling out with his brothers, no stated reason at all. He's there, orchestrating campaigns at the height of Viking power in England, and then, within the sparse entries of the chronicles, he isn't. Here's what you have to understand about how genuinely strange this gap is, especially compared to how thoroughly the earlier years of this campaign are documented. Chroniclers who carefully recorded the fall of York, the deaths of rival kings, the martyrdom of Edmund, suddenly have nothing meaningful to say about the departure of the campaign's most strategically important figure. That silence itself has become one of the most debated puzzles in the entire study of this period, and historians have spent generations trying to fill in a gap the original sources simply refuse to explain. Picture the last moments where Ivar does appear clearly in English sources, still very much at the height of his influence, still very much central to the ongoing campaign against the remaining English kingdoms. And then picture the chronicle entries that follow, continuing to track the great heathen army's activities under different leadership, mentioning other commanders, other campaigns, without a single word explaining what happened to the man who'd been so central to everything up to this point. It's the kind of gap that would be almost comic if it weren't so genuinely frustrating for anyone trying to piece together an accurate historical account. Imagine reading a serialized story where one of the 2 main characters simply vanishes between chapters, with the narrator acting as though nothing at all unusual has happened. There's a genuine scholarly debate worth sitting with here, because multiple competing theories have been proposed to explain this departure, and none of them command anything close to universal agreement. One theory suggests health, plain and straightforward, that whatever physical condition had shaped Ivar's entire life, whatever made him unable to walk or stand unaided, may have progressively worsened over years of grueling campaign life, eventually making it impossible for him to continue the kind of sustained military involvement the English campaign demanded. If that's the explanation, there's something quietly poignant about it. A man whose mind had triumphed over his body for his entire adult life, finally being forced to acknowledge limits that ambition alone couldn't overcome forever. Another theory, and one that connects directly to those whispers of internal tension explored just a moment ago, suggests that shifting power dynamics within the broader Viking coalition made Ivar's continued leadership increasingly difficult to sustain, that rival ambitions among fellow commanders had genuinely eroded his position to the point where stepping back, whether voluntarily or under pressure, became the more strategic choice. This reading would fit the pattern of a man who has spent his entire life recognizing when a fight isn't worth having, choosing instead to redirect his energy toward opportunities where his particular strengths could still dominate. And then there's a third possibility, one that will become increasingly important as this story continues. And honestly, the theory that most of the fragmentary evidence seems to support, that Ivar didn't retire or fade away at all, but rather redirected his ambitions entirely, turning his attention toward an entirely different theatre of Viking activity, one where his name, or a name remarkably similar to his, begins appearing in sources from a completely different part of the Viking world. Here's the striking historical fact that makes this third theory so compelling around this same general period. a figure named Eamar begins appearing prominently in Irish annals, a powerful Norse leader operating in and around Dublin, building what would become one of the most significant Viking power centres anywhere in the British Isles. The name similarity alone would be intriguing, but there's more to it than just a coincidence of naming, the timing, the scope of ambition. The strategic patterns all bear a resemblance that has led many historians to conclude these two figures, English Ivar and Irish Eamar, may well be one and the same man. We're going to dig into that Irish connection properly very soon because it opens up an entirely different chapter of this story, one that most retellings of Ivar's life in England conveniently skip past or barely mention. But for now, sit with the mystery itself for a moment. A man builds an empire of conquest across 3 English kingdoms through sheer strategic brilliance, becomes one of the most feared warlords of his era, and then simply vanishes from the record at the height of his power, leaving behind nothing but silence, speculation, and a tantalizing name appearing an ocean away in an entirely different set of chronicles, describing an entirely different kind of kingdom being built from scratch. Cross the Irish Sea with me now, because this is where Ivar's story takes a turn that most retellings focused entirely on his English conquests tend to rush past or ignore altogether. If the theory connecting him to the Irish annals holds, and a genuinely significant number of historians now find that connection persuasive, then the man who vanished from English chronicles didn't retire at all. He simply redirected an entire empire's worth of ambition toward a different island, a different set of rivals, and a different kind of kingdom entirely. Here's what you have to understand about Dublin in this period, because it isn't yet the city you might picture if you know it today. It exists as a Norse settlement established decades earlier by Viking raiders and traders who recognized its strategic value and natural harbour, positioned perfectly for controlling trade and raiding routes across the Irish Sea, connecting Scandinavian settlements in Britain with Norse territories stretching as far as the Scottish Isles and beyond. By the time the figure the Irish annals call Eamar rises to prominence there, Dublin has already become one of the most important Norse power centres outside Scandinavia, itself a genuine hub of trade, particularly the deeply uncomfortable trade in captured slaves alongside silver goods and political influence. Picture the scene of a man arriving into this world already carrying a fearsome reputation from campaigns fought an entire sea away, stepping into the tangled, brutal politics of Irish kingship, where dozens of competing regional kings called RI constantly shift alliances, wage border skirmishes and jockey for the increasingly important title of High King over the whole island. This isn't the relatively straightforward four-kingdom political map Ivar navigated in England. Ireland's political landscape in this era is far more fractured, far more complicated, and arguably requires an even sharper strategic mind to navigate successfully. And here's the striking historical fact worth sitting with. The annals describe Eamar not simply as another Viking raider passing through, but as a genuinely dominant political figure, someone who establishes lasting authority over Dublin and works to extend Norse influence deeper into Irish affairs than most Viking leaders before him had managed. If this is indeed Ivar the Boneless, then the man who couldn't walk without assistance has now built not one but 2 significant spheres of political dominance on 2 different islands, in 2 dramatically different political systems within a single lifetime. That's an almost absurd level of achievement for anyone, let alone a man whose body required constant physical assistance just to move through a room. There's a quirky, almost darkly funny detail worth pausing on here, one that captures something about how differently this second chapter of his career gets remembered compared to the first. In England, Ivar's legacy is preserved largely through Anglo-Saxon chronicles and later Norse sagas, both traditions with their own storytelling agendas, their own dramatic flourishes. In Ireland, the record comes primarily through Irish monastic annals, terse factual entries recorded year by year, remarkably unsentimental compared to the elaborate saga tradition surrounding his English exploits. It's almost like reading two entirely different biographies of the same man, one written as legend, the other written as bureaucratic record-keeping. And somehow both are describing the same relentlessly ambitious figure. Here's where a genuine scholarly debate becomes relevant again, because not every historian accepts the identification between English Ivar and Irish Eamar without reservation. The names, while similar, aren't identical, and naming conventions across different linguistic traditions and centuries of translation and transcription can create false connections just as easily as they can confirm real ones. Some scholars point to timeline questions, wondering whether the chronology of Eamar's activities in Ireland lines up cleanly enough with Ivar's documented final years in England to support treating them as definitively the same person. Others find the combination of timing, ambition, and strategic pattern simply too compelling to dismiss as coincidence. And this second camp currently represents something closer to the scholarly mainstream, though the debate has never been fully settled and probably never will be, given how thin the direct evidence connecting the two identities actually is. What's not in dispute, regardless of which side of that debate you find more convincing, is that the figure ruling Dublin during this period becomes the founder of what historians now call the Uí or the dynasty of Eamar, a Norse Gaelic ruling family that will go on to dominate Viking politics across Ireland, the Scottish Isles, and parts of northern England for well over a century after this founding figure's death. If Ivar truly is Eamar, then his legacy didn't end with his disappearance from English chronicles at all. It simply transformed into something that would outlast anything he built in England, a bloodline of kings and warlords stretching forward through generations, reshaping the political landscape of the entire Irish Sea region. But building a dynasty, as you're about to see, is rarely a peaceful business, and the tangled, often violent politics of Irish kingship are about to test this ambitious Norse warlord in ways his English campaigns never quite did. If you thought England's fractured four-kingdom rivalry made for complicated politics, Ireland is about to show you what genuinely tangled political warfare looks like. Here's what you have to understand about the world Eamar has stepped into. Unlike England's relatively small number of major kingdoms competing for dominance, Ireland in this period is a patchwork of dozens of smaller kingdoms overlapping loyalties and shifting alliances that could turn allies into enemies within a single season, all competing beneath the theoretical and often deeply contested authority of whoever currently holds or claims the title of High King. Picture Eamar navigating this landscape not as an outsider, crudely imposing Norse power through pure conquest, but as a genuinely skilled political operator, someone willing to form alliances with Irish kings when it served his interests, just as readily as he wages war against them when it doesn't. This flexibility marks a real departure from the more straightforward conquest and tribute pattern that defined his English campaigns. Ireland's political complexity seems to demand and seems to reward exactly the kind of patient, calculating strategic mind that had always been Ivar's greatest weapon, arguably even more than it had in England. Here's a striking historical fact worth sitting with. Sources describe Eamar forming an alliance, at least for a period, with Amlaíb, another significant Norse leader active in Dublin during roughly this same era, the two of them apparently ruling jointly or in close coordination over the Dublin settlement and its surrounding sphere of influence for a stretch of years. Whether Amlaíb and Eamar were brothers, as some later sources suggest, or simply closely allied political partners bound by mutual interest rather than blood, remains genuinely debated among historians. Another one of those frustrating gaps where the surviving evidence simply doesn't give us enough to be certain. What is clearer is that this partnership, whatever its exact nature, pursued campaigns extending Norse influence deeper into Irish territory, including notable involvement in conflicts around the ancient and symbolically crucial site of Dumbarton Rock, a fortress representing the kingdom of Strathclyde far to the north, well outside Ireland proper. Picture the scale of ambition this represents. A Norse-Irish power base in Dublin extending its military reach all the way north into what's now Scotland, laying siege to one of the most formidably defended strongholds in the entire British Isles. The siege, according to the annals, lasts for months, an extraordinary commitment of resources and patience for a fortress that most contemporary observers likely assumed was simply too well defended to fall. And here's the quirky, almost darkly comic detail worth including here. When Dumbarton finally does fall, the victorious Norse forces reportedly needed an enormous fleet numbering in the hundreds of ships, simply to transport back to Dublin all the captives and plunder seized from the fallen stronghold. Imagine the logistics of that operation alone. An army that spent months patiently starving out a fortress suddenly needing to figure out how to move that much captured wealth and that many captured people across open water without the entire enterprise collapsing into chaos. It's the kind of detail that reminds you these campaigns, however romanticized they become in later retelling, they were fundamentally logistical operations as much as they were military ones, and logistics, as we've seen throughout this entire story, happened to be exactly the kind of problem Ivar's mind was built to solve. But alliances built on mutual interest rather than deep loyalty carry their own risks, and here's where the story turns darker again, in a way that should feel familiar if you remember how quickly whispers of doubt began circulating even within Ivar's own English coalition once circumstances grew complicated. The broader world of Norse-Irish politics during this period is littered with examples of alliances collapsing into betrayal, partners turning on each other the moment shifting circumstances made cooperation less advantageous than conflict. Whatever the precise nature of Imar's partnership with Amlaib, it's worth remembering that in this world, blood ties themselves offered no guarantee of loyalty. Rival Viking dynasties, rival Irish kings, even members of the same family could and did turn against each other with startling speed whenever ambition demanded it. Here's the scholarly debate worth raising as this section closes. Some historians argue that Imar's ultimate dominance in Dublin came at least partly at the expense of former allies, that the Ui-Imar dynasty he founded consolidated power in ways that required sidelining or outmaneuvering rivals who had once fought alongside him. Others suggest the record simply reflects the normal brutal churn of this era's politics, rather than any specific betrayal on Imar's part. Either way, what's undeniable is that by the time his position in Dublin becomes fully secure, Ivar the Boneless has once again proven something he first demonstrated as a boy watching his brothers spar from the sidelines of a northern longhouse, that in a world built on shifting loyalties and violent ambition, the sharpest mind in the room tends to outlast everyone who relied purely on strength. But even the sharpest mind eventually runs out of years, and the final chapter of Ivar's extraordinary life is fittingly one of the murkiest and most disputed of them all. Every legend eventually has to end, and Ivar's ending is appropriately enough for a man whose entire life resists easy explanation. One of the most frustratingly uncertain conclusions in this entire story. If you've been hoping for a clean, dramatic final battle to close out this campaign, a moment where the Boneless Terror finally meets his match in some suitably epic confrontation, I have to be honest with you now. That's not what the sources give us. What they give us instead is silence, contradiction, and just enough scattered fragments to make historians argue for generations without ever fully agreeing. Here's what you have to understand about the state of the historical record as we approach the end of Ivar's life, the Irish annals. Generally more reliable and consistent than the more legend-heavy Norse saga tradition record the death of Imar of Dublin in a specific year, describing him with language that suggests genuine respect for the scale of what he'd built, language that some translations render as acknowledging him as King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain, an extraordinary title if it reflects the reality of his actual authority at the time of his death. Picture what that title actually implies if the identification between Ivar and Imar holds, which, as we discussed, remains genuinely debated but represents the position most historians currently favour. A man born with a body that couldn't support him without assistance, dismissed by nothing in the sources as anything other than what he clearly was physically, limited in ways that should have disqualified him entirely from the violent, physically demanding world of Viking Age leadership dies, having been acknowledged at least by one significant chronicle tradition as the most powerful Norse ruler across two entire regions of the British Isles. That's not just an impressive career. That's one of the most remarkable individual political achievements of the entire Viking Age, achieved by a man who never personally swung a sword in anger throughout the entirety of the historical record. But here's where the certainty starts to dissolve, and where you have to hold everything that follows a little more loosely than the confident narrative arc of the rest of this story might suggest. The precise cause of his death goes unrecorded in the annals, leaving open every possibility from illness, perhaps connected to whatever underlying physical condition had shaped his entire life, to violence, to simply the ordinary mortality that eventually claims every human life regardless of how remarkable it's been. Historians still argue over which explanation deserves more weight, and honestly, given how thin the direct evidence is, that argument is unlikely to ever produce a fully satisfying resolution. There's a genuinely strange detail worth sitting with here, one that highlights just how much confusion surrounds even the basic facts of Ivar's final years. Some later Norse saga sources, working from an entirely different storytelling tradition than the Irish annals, describe Ivar's death occurring back in England or in Scandinavia, rather than in Ireland at all, sometimes attributing it to illness, occasionally weaving in more legendary or symbolic elements that read less like historical record and more like the kind of narrative flourish that Norse saga writers love to add to any prominent figure's final chapter. These accounts don't line up cleanly with the Irish annals record of Ivar's death in Dublin, and reconciling them requires either assuming one tradition is simply more reliable than the other, or accepting that we may be dealing with genuinely contradictory folk memory that developed independently across different storytelling traditions separated by both geography and centuries of oral transmission before anything was written down. Here's a quirky, almost darkly funny detail worth including amid all this uncertainty. One later saga tradition claims Ivar, sensing his death approaching, requested to be buried in a specific location precisely because he believed his continued presence there, even in death, would offer magical protection against future invasion of that territory. It's a strange, almost touching final gesture, if there's any truth to it at all. A man who spent his entire life using strategy, presence to project power, now hoping that even his corpse might continue doing exactly the same work after he's gone. Whether that story reflects any genuine historical practice or is purely later legendary embellishment is, like nearly everything else about Ivar's final years, impossible to determine with any real confidence. And here's the striking historical fact worth closing on. Regardless of exactly how, where, or when Ivar the Boneless actually died, the impact of what he built during his lifetime demonstrably outlasted him by well over a century. The Ui-Emir dynasty he founded, or at minimum, was central to founding continued dominating Norse politics across Ireland, Scotland, and northern England for generations after his death. A Viking political dynasty whose reach and longevity few other individual Norse leaders of this era can genuinely claim to have matched. The man who couldn't walk without help built an empire that walked on for 100 years after him. And what happens to that legacy, to the bloodline, and the burial legends that grew up around his memory is where this story turns next into the strange, contested territory where history and myth become almost impossible to fully separate. Remember that quirky detail about Ivar requesting burial in a specific place, believing his corpse itself might continue offering protection against invasion. That single fragment of legend deserves far more attention than the brief mention it got earlier because it opens into one of the strangest, most genuinely debated corners of Ivar's entire afterlife in Norse storytelling. And it's worth sitting inside properly now. Here's what you have to understand about how death worked differently for legendary figures in Norse saga tradition compared to how modern readers might expect a historical account to function. For most ordinary people in this era, death is simply death recorded briefly if recorded at all. the body returned to earth through whatever burial custom the local community practiced. But for figures who'd already crossed over into legend during their own lifetimes, figures like Ivar, death often becomes just another opportunity for storytellers to add one final memorable flourish to an already extraordinary narrative. Picture the specific version of this burial legend that survives in later Norse sources. Ivar, according to this tradition, requested burial, not in some ordinary location, but in a place specifically chosen for its strategic significance, a spot positioned to guard against future seaborne invasion of the territory he'd fought so hard to control. The legend claims that as long as his body remained undisturbed in that specific burial site, the land itself would remain protected, defended by some lingering supernatural quality attached to his remains, his reputation, or perhaps simply the fear his name continued to inspire even after death. And here's where the story takes a genuinely dramatic turn, because according to this same saga tradition, that protection didn't last forever. Later accounts claim that a different, much later Norman conqueror deliberately sought out and destroyed Ivar's burial site specifically to break whatever protective power the legend attributed to it. A symbolic act meant to demonstrate that the old Norse magic, if it had ever existed at all, no longer held any power against a new wave of invasion sweeping across Britain, centuries after Ivar's own campaigns had reshaped the political landscape. Whether any of this reflects actual historical events or represents purely symbolic, legendary storytelling meant to mark a transition between one era of conquest and another is, characteristically for this entire final chapter of Ivar's story, genuinely impossible to determine with confidence. Here's a striking historical fact worth sitting with, regardless of how much of that specific burial legend you're inclined to believe. Archaeological excavations in England have, at various points, uncovered mass burial sites containing remains consistent with Viking Age warrior populations, and some of these discoveries have been popularly, though far from conclusively, connected to Ivar's forces, or even to Ivar himself, by researchers and media eager to draw a direct line between ancient legend and physical evidence. One particularly notable excavation uncovered a substantial collection of remains showing clear signs of violent death, interred with weapons and grave goods, consistent with high-status Viking Age burial practices. Findings that generated considerable excitement about a possible direct connection to the Great Heathen Army's activities in England. But here's where you need to apply the same careful skepticism we've applied throughout this entire story. Because archaeologists and historians studying these findings have generally cautioned against drawing overly confident conclusions, connecting any specific excavated remains directly to Ivar personally. The evidence supports general conclusions about Viking Age warrior burial practices and confirms the physical reality of large-scale Norse military activity in England during roughly this period. But connecting any specific set of bones to a specific named individual from a saga tradition already known for exaggeration and embellishment requires a leap of certainty the physical evidence simply doesn't support on its own. There's a quirky, almost dryly funny irony worth noting here, one that captures something essential about Ivar's entire posthumous legacy. A man whose living body was defined by fragility, by an inability to stand or walk without assistance, has become in death the subject of legends about an almost supernaturally protective invincible corpse, a body so significant that destroying it required a deliberate act by a later conqueror, specifically to neutralize its lingering power. The physical weakness that shaped his entire life story gets transformed through centuries of retelling into something closer to the opposite entirely. A body so potent even in death that entire kingdoms supposedly depended on its resting place remaining undisturbed. And here's the question worth carrying forward as this section closes: whatever actually happened to Ivar's physical remains, wherever his body actually rests, if it survives in any identifiable form at all after 12 centuries, the more important legacy was never really about his corpse in the first place. It was about the dynasty he founded, the political structures he helped establish across 2 different islands, and the reputation that outlasted every physical trace of the man himself. That legacy, unlike the contested burial legends, is something historians can trace with considerably more confidence, and it's where this story turns next. Set aside the burial legends, the contested corpse, the uncertain final years, and look instead at something historians can actually trace with real confidence across the historical record the dynasty Ivar left behind. The Ui-Imaya, a bloodline that would go on to dominate Norse politics across Ireland, Scotland, and northern England for well over a century after his death. This is where his legacy stops being legend and starts being demonstrable political fact, and it's arguably more impressive than any single battle or conquest from his own lifetime. Here's what you have to understand about how remarkable this dynastic longevity actually was within the broader context of Viking Age politics. Most Norse warlords of this era, even genuinely successful ones, built power that lasted a single lifetime, sometimes barely surviving their own death before rival claimants tore apart whatever they'd assembled. Dynasties that persisted across multiple generations, that maintained coherent political identity and territorial influence for a century or more, were genuinely rare. The Ui-Imaya managed exactly that, and in a political landscape as fractured and violent as Norse-Irish and Norse-British affairs during this period. That kind of persistence required something well beyond simple military strength. It required exactly the kind of adaptable, patient, strategic thinking that had defined Ivar's own career from his earliest years. Picture the scope of territory this dynasty came to influence across the generations that followed. Dublin remained a central power base, but descendants and successors within this bloodline extended influence into York itself, the very city Ivar had helped conquer decades earlier, creating a genuinely remarkable circular connection between his English conquests and his Irish dynasty's later expansion. Members of this family line would go on to rule as kings of Dublin, exercise significant influence over Northumbria, and maintain political relevance across the Irish Sea region through multiple generations of shifting alliances, rebellions, and reconquests. There's a striking historical fact worth sitting with here. One of the most famous descendants associated with this dynastic line would eventually be involved in events connected to the Battle of Clontarf, a conflict fought well over a century after Ivar's own death, still remembered today as one of the pivotal confrontations in Irish history, involving the legendary Irish High King Brian Boru. Whether every genealogical connection claimed in later medieval sources holds up to modern scrutiny is, as always with the family trees, genuinely debated among historians who study how much later medieval writers embellished or simplified real bloodlines for their own political purposes. But even accounting for that skepticism, the broad pattern is clear enough. Ivar's political and biological legacy remained relevant to major events in Irish and British history for generations after anyone who'd actually known him personally had died. Here's a quirky detail worth including, one that adds an almost comic layer to how thoroughly this dynasty's influence saturated the region's politics. At various points across the following century, competing branches of the same broader Ui-Imaya bloodline found themselves fighting against each other, cousins and distant relatives backing rival claims to the same territories their shared ancestor had once controlled outright. It's a familiar pattern across dynastic history everywhere. Families whose founding figure achieved remarkable unity, eventually fragmenting into competing branches, each one convinced their particular claim represented the true inheritance. Ivar. Watching from wherever, legend imagines a figure like him, watching from, might have found something darkly amusing in that outcome, given how much of his own early life involved outmaneuvering people who underestimated him within his own family circle. And here's the genuine scholarly debate worth raising as this section moves toward its conclusion. Historians continue to argue about exactly how much credit Ivar personally deserves for this dynasty's eventual success, versus how much should go to his successors who actually built and expanded what he initially established. Some scholars emphasize Ivar's foundational role, arguing that the strategic template he created in Dublin, the specific combination of political flexibility and calculated force, provided the essential model his successors simply had to maintain rather than reinvent. Others push back, suggesting it's easy to retroactively credit a founding figure with achievements that actually depended far more on the skill and adaptability of the generations that followed him. What's not in dispute, regardless of where you land in that debate, is the raw scale of what traces back in one way or another to a crippled Viking boy who once sat watching from the edges of a northern longhouse while his brothers sparred without him. 3 English kingdoms brought to their knees during his own lifetime. A dynasty spanning Ireland, Scotland, and northern England for generations afterward. And archaeological curiosity nearly 12 centuries after his death. Very few figures from this entire violent, chaotic era of history left a mark this deep, this lasting, or this genuinely difficult to fully separate from the legends that grew up around it. And now, as this remarkable story approaches its final chapter, it's worth stepping back one last time to consider what all of this actually means. What Ivar the Boneless ultimately represents in the broader sweep of English and Irish history, and why a man defined so completely by physical limitation ended up reshaping the political map of 2 entire islands more thoroughly than almost anyone else in his era. Step back now, all the way back past the dynasty, past the burial legends, past the conquests themselves, to that firelit longhouse, where this story actually began, a fragile, oddly formed infant, born into a warrior culture that had no obvious place for a body like his. Everything that follows from that moment, every kingdom humbled, every rival outmaneuvered, every dynasty founded an ocean away from where he started, traces back to a simple, brutal fact of 9th century life. This was a world that should have discarded him, and instead he rewrote its entire political map. Here's what you have to understand about why Ivar's story genuinely matters beyond its individual dramatic details. Beyond the Blood Eagle debates and the vanishing acts and the contested burial sites, he represents something that challenges one of the most persistent assumptions people carry about the Viking Age specifically, and about medieval warrior societies more broadly, the assumption that power in this era flowed almost exclusively from physical dominance, from the size of your sword arm and your willingness to use it. Ivar's entire career stands as a direct, undeniable counterexample to that assumption. Proof that even in a culture built around martial prowess, the sharpest strategic mind in the room could outmaneuver every warrior who relied purely on strength. Picture the sheer geographic and political scope of what one man's strategic vision ultimately touched. Whether directly or through the dynasty, he founded Northumbria, conquered its rival kings dead, East Anglia's king martyred, his death still commemorated in a town that carries his name today, Mercia humbled into tribute. A kingdom in Dublin built from nothing into one of the most significant Norse power centres outside Scandinavia itself. A dynasty extending influence across Ireland, Scotland and northern England for 100 years and more after his own death. Its descendants still shaping major events like the Battle of Clontarf generations later. That's an almost absurd scope of lasting historical influence for a single human life, particularly one lived inside a body that required constant assistance just to move from room to room. And here's the striking historical fact worth sitting with as this story reaches its close. Modern historians studying the broader Viking expansion across Britain and Ireland during this period consistently identify the Great Heathen Armies campaign, and Ivar's foundational role within it as one of the genuine turning points in early medieval British history, a moment that permanently altered the trajectory of English political development, contributed directly to the eventual rise of a unified English kingdom under Wessex as the last kingdom standing against Norse conquest, and simultaneously helped establish patterns of Norse-Gaelic political and cultural exchange that would shape Ireland and Scotland for centuries to come. Very few individual campaigns from this entire era can claim that kind of dual-lasting legacy across two entirely different regions. There's a quirky, oddly fitting detail worth ending on here, one final small human moment before this story closes for good. Across nearly 12 centuries of retelling through Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Irish annals, Norse sagas, and now tonight, through a story told for you to drift asleep to Ivar's nickname, has never once been fully explained with certainty. Historians still argue about it, just as they've argued through nearly every section of tonight's journey, about the Blood Eagle, about the burial legend, about the exact nature of his connection to Dublin's Emer. And there's something genuinely fitting about that persistent uncertainty, isn't there? A man who spent his entire life being underestimated, defying easy categorization, refusing to be defined purely by what his body could or couldn't do, remains even in death, even after 12 centuries of scholarly attention. A figure who resists being fully pinned down, whatever boneless actually meant, whatever combination of physical limitation and strategic brilliance actually produced the man who brought 3 English kingdoms to their knees and founded a dynasty that outlasted him by generations. One thing remains genuinely undeniable across every version of this story's sober chronicle or embellished saga alike. He was never actually the weak one in any room he entered, and by the time his enemies fully understood that, it was already far too late for any of them to do anything about it. The fires of that northern longhouse went out centuries ago. The ships that carried him across the North Sea rotted away long before anyone alive today was born, and the kingdoms he conquered have folded themselves layer by layer into the quiet, ordinary English and Irish countryside that exists now, green and still holding no visible trace of the terror that once swept across it. Let the battles fade now gently the way firelight fades to embers when no one feeds it anymore. Let the longships settle into still water, their sails lowered for good, their crews long since returned to dust and legend. The armies that once marched across England have nowhere left to march. The kings who once trembled behind their walls have long since found their rest, and so somewhere in the quiet dark of history has the boy who was carried rather than walked, who ruled through patience rather than strength, who taught an entire age that the mind can conquer what the body cannot. You don't have to carry any of it any further tonight. Let the outline of these old stories blur softly at the edges, the way distant coastlines blur into mist. There is nothing chasing you here. There is no army at your gate, no decision waiting to be made before morning, just the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing growing heavier, now growing calmer, pulling you gently away from longhouses and battlefields and back into the safety of your own quiet room. The stars that once lit those northern shores are the same stars faintly, dimly turning above you now, and they ask nothing of you except that you rest. The past is settled. The past is still. Every restless spirit in tonight's story has long since gone quiet, and so now can you. Let your shoulders soften into the bed beneath you. Let your thoughts one by one grow slower, softer, further apart, until there's nothing left but stillness or drifting silence. Sleep now. The world is quiet, and it is waiting for you gently, patiently, the way it always does. Sweet dreams.